A wealthy man ended up marrying his best friend's less attractive sister as a joke, but soon everything changed. In a stylish bar in Manhattan, where the country's elite mingled over imported cigars and clinking crystal glasses, Ethan Monroe stood in the middle of the celebration. Surrounded by powerful businessmen and attractive women, he marked yet another huge real estate deal that expanded his empire. His face graced magazine covers, his fortune kept growing with every transaction, and the admiration he received was almost palpable. Yet deep inside he felt empty. The passion that once drove him now seemed dull and routine as he caught his reflection in the dark windows while toasts echoed around him. Caleb Matthews, seated next to him, noticed the quiet fatigue behind Ethan's calm demeanor. Coming from one of the oldest families in the country, Caleb was skilled at spotting vulnerabilities and using them to his advantage. He had watched Ethan for many years, noting that despite his wealth and fame, his life followed a strict, predictable pattern. High-stakes business deals, flawless women, and a social schedule arranged down to every detail. Then Caleb came up with an idea. Between sips of aged whiskey, he challenged Ethan to a bet like none other, a bet that involved getting married, but not to anyone ordinary. Ethan was to wed a woman completely outside his usual type for 6 months, with no prenup and no financial perks, a genuine marriage with no guarantees or extra benefits. The idea was absurd. Ethan laughed and shook his head. Yet Caleb pressed on with a sly grin, teasing that Ethan had become too predictable, a man who could conquer anything with money and charm, but who was too scared to face a real challenge. The remark hit home, and then Caleb mentioned the name of the potential bride, Olivia Matthews. The moment Caleb said her name, Ethan raised an eyebrow. He had heard of her. She was nothing like the glamorous women he typically surrounded himself with. In fact, Olivia was the exact opposite, a dedicated academic and social activist who avoided the flashy events and superficial circles that Ethan thrived in. What truly shocked him was that Olivia was widely considered unattractive. Her face was severe, lacking the delicate features prized by his world, and her body did not conform to society's ideal. She dressed simply, with no hint of trying to catch anyone's eye, and was known to be as stubborn in her beliefs as she was in her temperament. Ethan realized that Olivia despised everything he stood for: excessive wealth, corporate power, and the endless pursuit of status. Marrying her seemed ludicrous and unthinkable, but refusing her would mean admitting he couldn't conquer any woman. With alcohol boosting his confidence and his wounded pride urging him on, he accepted the bet, a 6-month trial with a woman who would never willingly choose him. It was his opportunity to prove he could win over even the most resistant personality. The next morning, Ethan arrived early at his sleek office on Fifth Avenue. Without explaining much, he sent his driver to pick up Olivia, confident that summoning her would stir both discomfort and curiosity. He imagined her arriving with a scowl, trying to understand what a man like him could possibly want from someone like her. But he didn't care. Soon enough, security cameras caught her arrival. Olivia entered the building with a firm stance, carrying a worn leather bag and dressed in plain clothes that showed no hint of extravagance. Her hair was casually pulled back in a bun, and she wore no makeup. She scanned the lobby briefly without even acknowledging the lavish decor around her. Sitting comfortably in his office, Ethan decided to test her resolve. He deliberately made her wait while watching her reaction on the security feed. He was used to women growing anxious when delayed, checking their phones, fidgeting, or flirting with his assistants. Instead, Olivia calmly opened her bag, took out a book, and began reading. The unexpected composure intrigued him. The woman he expected to be uneasy was completely unfazed by his absence, totally indifferent to the power play he was trying to orchestrate. After a long wait of 40 minutes, he finally called her into his office. She walked in confidently, stopping right at his desk without showing any sign of nervousness. Her eyes scanned him with a mix of distrust and boredom, as though she were simply sizing up a predictable man. Ethan folded his fingers on the table and got straight to the point. He explained the bet in plain language, expecting her to react with shock or outrage. He detailed the 6-month marriage and emphasized that there would be no financial benefits whatsoever. To most, the offer would have sounded absurd, even insulting. But Olivia stayed silent for a few moments, merely observing him. Then, much to his surprise, she agreed. Ethan blinked several times, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. She didn't ask any questions, didn't show indignation or laugh. Instead, she laid down her own terms. She wouldn't quit her job at the university, wouldn't change her routine, and wouldn't become a decorative figure to be paraded around. For her, the marriage was simply a formality, nothing more. Her calm and clear tone unsettled Ethan. He had expected some resistance, perhaps bargaining or even insults. But Olivia treated the whole arrangement as if it held no significance, as if his presence was utterly irrelevant. When he tried to egg her on by suggesting that her world was more complex than she let on, Olivia sharply retorted that he was living in an ego bubble, in a shallow world where only money and power mattered. She challenged his view of life, asking if he had ever made any meaningful contributions beyond amassing fortunes and sealing business deals. Her voice stayed steady, and her gaze did not waver. Accustomed to being admired, Ethan felt an unfamiliar irritation, not because he was insulted, but because her words carried a truth he couldn't counter. When the conversation ended and Olivia rose to leave, Ethan watched her with new eyes. She was different, not just in appearance, but in the strength, intelligence, and unyielding defiance she displayed against the power he usually commanded. Later that chaotic afternoon, amid strategic meetings and phone calls involving multi-million-dollar deals, Ethan received a direct email from Olivia with the subject, wedding date. Expecting perhaps a suggestion to adjust the timing to suit his busy schedule, he was stunned to find that Olivia had already arranged everything. The date was set for Wednesday morning at the Civil Registry in Brooklyn, without any consultation, regard for his schedule, or room for negotiation. For a moment, Ethan considered ignoring the message. After all, he was typically in control, not Olivia. Who did she think she was, choosing the date without even asking him? His first instinct was to have his assistant rearrange everything, but before he could act, he decided to call her. Olivia picked up on the second ring, as though she had been expecting his call. "I hope you saw my message," she said plainly. Settling back in his leather chair, Ethan tried to keep his composure. "I saw it, but Wednesday doesn't work for me," he said. "Well, it works for me," she replied coolly. There was a pause. Ethan wasn't used to being contradicted so directly. "I have important meetings on Wednesday. Cancel them if you can't make it. There's no wedding otherwise." Without waiting for his response, she hung up. Ethan stared at the phone in disbelief. He couldn't recall the last time anyone had so brazenly cut him off. Here he was, a man who set deadlines, led negotiations, and steered major companies, forced to rearrange his schedule to marry on a day he hadn't chosen. On the wedding day, Ethan arrived at the registry office looking sharp in his custom navy suit, complete with a high-end Swiss watch and gold cufflinks. His presence commanded attention, and he was well aware of that fact. But when he saw Olivia, he noticed she had made no effort to dress up for the occasion. Instead of a glamorous dress or any sign of preparation, she wore a modest suit with flat shoes. Her hair was tied back in a simple bun, and her face was bare. She carried only a folder of documents. Nothing about her suggested that this day was important. The judge processed the ceremony without ceremony, verifying signatures and reading the terms of the marriage with the routine detachment of someone who performed dozens of weddings each day. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, just a stripped-down contract. When it was time to finalize the ceremony, Ethan leaned in slightly for a symbolic kiss, determined to maintain appearances even in a marriage of convenience. But before he could complete the gesture, Olivia raised her hand and firmly grasped his. "That's enough," she said, locking eyes with him. It was a deliberate gesture, a clear boundary with no room for misunderstanding. The message was unmistakable. This was merely an agreement, nothing more. Ethan couldn't decide which hurt him more. The fact that he was publicly rebuffed, or the ease with which Olivia dismissed him, as though he didn't matter at all. After leaving the registry office, Ethan tried to reassert control over the situation. Even if the marriage was just a contract, he was still a man of influence, and he wasn't about to let his wife simply disappear after the ceremony. "Let's have lunch," he suggested, pointing toward a nearby luxury parking lot. "I know a fantastic restaurant in Santa Fe." Olivia looked at him without a hint of interest. "I have a meeting with my students at the university. You can reschedule," she said firmly. Her refusal was immediate and left no room for debate. Ethan was stunned. No one had ever turned down an invitation from him before, especially not to one of the city's most exclusive eateries. He had expected some form of resistance, maybe even a challenge, but being completely ignored was entirely new. "It's just lunch, Olivia. We can talk about a few things regarding our marriage. It's all settled," he pressed. But she simply raised her hand to call a taxi. Ethan watched, perplexed, as she got into the car without looking back. She didn't wait for him to open the door or ask how she would get home, showing no interest in the world he offered her. Back in his car, Ethan sat in silence for several minutes. On impulse, he asked his assistant to gather every detail about Olivia's social projects. He needed to understand more about the woman who had just become his wife. He had always believed that money and power were irresistible, that everyone had a price deep down. But Olivia clearly wasn't driven by those things. For the first time, Ethan felt that he was not in control of the situation. Later that day, an elegant envelope arrived, its golden lettering announcing the year's most exclusive charity event. This was one of those high-profile gatherings that brought together influential figures, top businessmen, politicians, international royalty, and socialites who set trends and sealed deals with a handshake. Ethan never missed these events. They were not merely lavish parties, but arenas where connections were more valuable than bank balances.
He decided to take Olivia with him, not because he craved her company, but because he knew that such a setting was completely alien to her. He imagined that amid impeccably dressed elites, Olivia might finally feel the discomfort of not belonging.
Even if she wasn't swayed by his wealth, in that exclusive circle she might realize that fitting in required more than just a prestigious last name. That evening, Ethan waited for Olivia at the entrance of the hotel, prepared to face curious looks and subtle remarks. Dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo with Italian shoes and his usual air of confidence, he stood ready. When Olivia finally appeared, she wasn't in a flashy dress or bedecked with sparkling jewelry. Instead, she wore an elegant, tailored suit that was modest yet commanding. Her hair, usually tied up simply, now flowed naturally around her face. What struck Ethan most was her posture. She walked with an unshakable confidence, as if the luxurious surroundings had no impact on her. As they entered the main hall, all eyes turned toward them. Some glances were discreet, while others were openly curious. Everyone was eager to see how this woman, known for her frank criticism of greedy business practices, would react to such extreme luxury. But Olivia didn't hesitate. While Ethan greeted guests, she naturally stepped away to start her own conversations. What began as mere curiosity among the guests quickly turned into genuine admiration. Influential businessmen, who usually indulged in shallow talks about investments, found themselves drawn into deep discussions about social impact, sustainability, and education with Olivia. She didn't just lead the conversation, she challenged ideas, presented data, and made insights that captivated everyone's attention. Watching her from afar, Ethan realized that he was the one beginning to feel out of place. Caleb, holding a glass of whiskey and observing with a knowing smile, remarked, "I expected her to be overwhelmed, but look at her. Your wife is stealing the spotlight without any glitz or a famous name." Ethan didn't immediately reply, yet Something about the scene bothered him deeply. It wasn't anger or pride, it was pure discomfort. Before long, murmurs and whispers spread among the guests. Some quietly exchanged looks, while others openly laughed and shot disapproving glances. Women from the same circles as Ethan made harsh comments about Olivia's looks, suggesting she could never be the right wife for a man of his stature. Men, cloaking their sarcasm and humor, questioned how he could have traded his previous girlfriends, who were models or celebrities, for someone so plain. In the past, Ethan had never cared about such chatter because he always set the rules. But, for the first time, he felt uneasy when someone remarked with a crooked smile that Olivia clearly did not match him. Feeling an odd stirring inside him, he coolly replied, "Funny because no one here has spoken with half the intelligence she has." The room fell silent. For the first time, Ethan realized that he was more affected by the criticism than he expected. Turning his attention back to Olivia, he discovered something even more unexpected. As he listened to her discussions, he began to absorb more information than he had ever imagined. Every argument she made about social responsibility sparked an interest in him, a topic that had once seemed distant, but now made perfect sense. As the event wound down, Ethan experienced something he had never felt before. Instead of being noticed for his fortune or his power, he was now being recognized for speaking about something truly meaningful, and strangely, that gave him a different kind of satisfaction. Meanwhile, Caleb watched everything unfold with a subtle smile. The game had completely changed, and perhaps Ethan hadn't yet realized how much. For years, Ethan had built his company through strategic acquisitions, aggressive mergers, and calculated decisions that transformed his real estate empire into a true powerhouse. Every move had been planned to maximize profits, crush the competition, and secure his spot among the country's top businessmen. Nothing was left to chance, until now, when chance caught up with him. Reports began to show troubling numbers. Multi-million-dollar contracts with educational networks were suddenly canceled, investors pulled their funding, and strategic partners hesitated to renew agreements. At first, Ethan thought it was merely a normal market shift, but as days passed and losses mounted, it became clear that something far bigger was at play. The board of directors started pressuring him, executives demanded answers, and shareholders insisted on guarantees. Monroe Industries had never seen such a blow, and Ethan found himself forced to search for explanations. One report, in particular, caught his eye. A major social project tied to public education had become one of the firm's staunchest opponents. Unwittingly, Monroe Industries had made decisions that negatively affected educational programs supported by independent foundations. As he reviewed the data, a familiar name appeared among those responsible: Olivia Matthews. The connection was impossible to ignore. For the first time since agreeing to that absurd marriage, Ethan realized that Olivia was far more intertwined in his world than he had imagined. Worse yet, she might be partly responsible for his company's current difficulties. Without alerting her, he decided to pay her a visit that afternoon. His car glided through the busy streets of the city, heading toward a neighborhood far removed from the towering buildings he was used to. The address led him to a community center, a modest building with no flashy signage or major corporate sponsors. Stepping out of his car, he immediately felt out of place. Everything there contrasted sharply with his own world. The worn corridors, basic classrooms, barefoot children, and teachers engaged in lively conversations with small groups of students. But what caught his eye the most was Olivia. Sitting on the courtyard floor, surrounded by a group of teenagers who listened intently, she spoke with passion, her eyes shining as she explained educational opportunities and how knowledge could change lives. In that moment, she wasn't the cold, distant woman he knew from home. She was entirely different. Ethan watched for a while before forcing himself to step forward. When Olivia saw him, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "We need to talk," he replied, ignoring the presence of the students. Olivia stood up, muttered a few words to the kids, and walked toward him with her arms crossed. "If you're here to convince me to abandon my projects, you're wasting your time. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to understand what exactly you're planning against my organization." Olivia let out a short, humorless laugh. "You really think everything revolves around your company, don't you?" she said, gesturing expansively. "Look around, Ethan. I'm not fighting against you. I'm fighting for these people." Ethan narrowed his eyes, but before he could reply, Caleb interjected. "It's interesting how fate makes everything come together." Approaching with an enigmatic calm that contrasted sharply with Ethan's unease, Caleb asked, "What do you mean by that?" in a slightly irritated tone. Caleb sighed and folded his arms. "Maybe it's time you heard the whole story." The three of them moved into an empty room within the community center. Olivia remained silent, her eyes fixed on her brother with clear resentment. Caleb leaned against a table and began. "Did you know that many years ago there was a publishing company called Matthews Publishing?" Ethan didn't immediately answer, though the name stirred something familiar in his mind even if he couldn't recall the details. "It belonged to our father," Caleb continued slowly. "It was an independent publisher that printed affordable textbooks for public schools. My father truly believed that education could change lives. He was an idealist. Though idealists don't always survive in the business world." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling an uneasy knot forming inside him. "What happened?" he asked. "Monroe Industries was behind it," Olivia finally said, her voice as cold as ice. "Your real estate empire forced our father's publishing company out of the building it occupied. A small setback for you, but a death sentence for us. Our father never recovered. The company went bankrupt, and he soon fell ill." In that moment, Ethan felt remorse unlike anything he had known in years. Then Caleb pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to him. "This was left for you," he said. Ethan took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he read the name Daniel Matthews on its front. Slowly, he opened it and removed a yellowed letter. As he read, his stomach churned. Daniel's words were not filled with hatred or revenge, but with disappointment. He urged Ethan to look beyond the money and see that his business decisions weren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They affected real lives, leaving no second chances for those whose stories were wiped out by power. By the time Ethan finished, his hands were shaking for the first time. Ethan Monroe began to wonder if he had really built anything of true value, if the entire empire he had created was worth the cost of the lives he had trampled along the way. That evening, in an elegantly lit event hall that was refined rather than extravagant, the focus was on social causes rather than opulence. Business leaders, activists, and academics moved between tables, exchanging ideas and contacts while speakers took the stage to discuss the challenges facing education in the country. Ethan was there as a special guest. Ever since he had started to understand the importance of social projects, he had tried to be more active in those circles, partly to prove something to Olivia, and partly because he began to believe that his involvement might truly make a difference. Elsewhere in the hall, Olivia was engaged in conversation with a group of teachers and representatives from underprivileged communities. Dressed simply yet carrying herself with unmistakable confidence, she left Ethan watching from afar with a heavy heart. He knew he had to confess the truth. It made no sense to keep hiding what he had done. He admitted to himself that he had made mistakes in the past, even if unintentionally, and that his empire had been built on foundations he never bothered to examine. Now, standing before Olivia in the shadow of her father's legacy, he couldn't ignore what he had done any longer. Waiting until she was alone near the main table with a glass of water in hand, he slowly approached. "We need to talk," he said. Startled by the serious tone in his voice, Olivia replied, "Yes, it's important." Her voice carried the weariness of the past few intense days, as their already fragile relationship teetered between cold indifference and brief moments of calm. They moved to a quieter corner of the hall. Ethan hesitated for a moment, knowing he could delay no longer. "Olivia, "I've discovered something you need to know. Something about your father," he said. She furrowed her brow and crossed her arms. "What do you mean?" she asked. Taking a deep breath, Ethan continued. "Monroe Industries is responsible for the bankruptcy of your father's publishing company." His words hung in the air like an invisible blow, taking time to settle. Olivia blinked, as though trying to process what she had just heard. "My business group bought the building where Matthews Press was located, and that acquisition forced your father's company out. He never recovered," she repeated. "I didn't know this at the time, but now I do." Olivia's face hardened further. "So you're telling me my family was ruined by your empire?" Ethan tried to keep his composure, but something in her gaze unsettled him. "I didn't do it on purpose, but yes, my company caused that," he admitted. Anger flashed across her face as she took a step back, as if needing space. "You knew about this and never told me. I only found out recently. And now I need time to figure out how you expect me to take this without feeling disgusted." Her voice was laden with indignation, and Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Olivia, I never wanted to destroy your father's life," he tried to say, but she interrupted with a bitter laugh. "That doesn't matter now. The fact is, it happened, and the worst part is, you even tried to convince me you were changing." Her laugh was bitter and full of frustration. "Deep down, you're still the same corporate predator, always pretending to have a conscience, always acting like you feel remorse. In the end, it's still all about how you feel about your own guilt." Ethan swallowed hard. He could debate business all day, but he didn't know how to counter her words. "I understand you're angry, but you don't really understand anything," she said, her eyes brimming not with sadness, but with fury. "You ruined my father's life, and now you're here expecting forgiveness." Ethan was at a loss for words, feeling more powerless than ever before. Then, without another word, Olivia turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the hall, feeling utterly isolated. In the days that followed, Olivia refused to speak to him. The marriage of convenience, which had once meant nothing, now weighed heavily on them both. The silence between them became almost unbearable. Ethan knew that apologies wouldn't be enough, and he had to take action. He spent sleepless nights reviewing documents and devising strategies, searching for a way to make amends. Matthews Publishing was gone, but its legacy could be revived. He gathered investors, created a special fund to support independent writers, and ensured every step was handled with genuine integrity. The new publishing house would be funded by him, but operated independently, free from any control by Monroe Industries. When everything was in place, he put the documents into an envelope without signing his name or including a business card. Later that afternoon, he drove to the organization where Olivia worked. She wasn't there, and perhaps that was for the best. He left the envelope on her desk and walked away without expecting any reply. Now, all that was left was time. Would this be enough for Olivia to forgive him? He wasn't sure, but for the first time, Ethan wasn't just doing something for himself. He was trying to do what was right. For over an hour, Olivia held the envelope in her hands. It sat on her desk at the organization, sealed and unmarked. It could easily have been just another bureaucratic document or a financial report, but she knew it was from him. Taking a deep breath, she opened it. Inside, she found a detailed plan, a carefully thought-out blueprint for rebuilding Matthews Press. The initiative aimed to launch a new publishing imprint focused on independent writers and accessible educational materials. It included budgets, operational guidelines, and a solid financial plan, all without any direct interference from Monroe Industries. Ethan would fund it, but he wouldn't control it. Olivia skimmed through the pages, analyzing each detail with both skepticism and intrigue. The project was solid and well-structured, but the real question wasn't in the numbers or strategies. It was about the man behind it.
Had Ethan truly changed, or was this just another attempt to make amends? For years, Ethan had embodied everything Olivia despised about the corporate world. Now he was offering a way to restore her father's legacy. But Olivia knew that true intentions are shown by actions, not just words.
She didn't call him, didn't thank him, and didn't tell anyone about the envelope. Instead, she kept the papers and decided to wait, to see if Ethan truly intended to change without her having to demand it. Days later, while attending a book fair in Austin, she saw him. Ethan was there quietly, without the usual entourage or the pomp of a successful businessman. He wandered among the stalls, listened to discussions, picked up books, and absorbed conversations about literature and education. He didn't approach her or try to be noticed. He was simply there. That bothered her more than if he had tried to speak up. A book fair was not the sort of event Ethan would normally attend, or at least not the man she thought he was. Yet the man who sat listening to a presentation on public reading policies now seemed different. In the weeks that followed, she began to see him at other events, without fanfare, without grand speeches. Ethan started attending conferences on social impact and meetings on social responsibility, events that would never have been on his previous agenda. He wasn't trying to impress her or force a conversation. He was simply present and attentive. Frustration grew inside her. Part of Olivia wanted to believe it was all a calculated strategy, a way to manipulate the narrative in his favor. But another part began to wonder if he was genuinely changing. After weeks of silence, she decided to confront him. She found him at the headquarters of Monroe Industries, high in one of the skyscrapers overlooking the city. Ethan was alone, staring out at the horizon when she walked in unexpectedly. "I thought you wouldn't speak to me again," he said, turning in surprise. Crossing his arms, he added, "I haven't decided yet whether I should." Olivia tossed the envelope with the documents onto his desk and asked, "Do you really want to do this? If I hadn't started, I wouldn't be here. Why did you begin?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, searching for the right words. "I'm tired of being the man who wrecks everything," he finally admitted. His answer took her by surprise. "And you think that by funding a publishing house you can make up for everything you've done?" she challenged. "No, it's not a complete fix, but it's a start," he replied sincerely. Olivia studied his face and noticed something different. Less arrogance, less certainty. For the first time, she believed he might be honest. "If this is really just a start, Ethan, then what comes next?" he asked, turning back to gaze at the city as if searching for an answer among the buildings he had helped create. "I'm still figuring it out," he confessed. Olivia said nothing further. She simply picked up the documents again and left, though she didn't entirely discard the possibility of trusting him. In the months that followed, Ethan proved that his intentions went beyond mere redemption. He launched a full restructuring at Monroe Industries, eliminating exploitative investments, ending abusive contracts, and redirecting resources to social impact initiatives. His changes were met with resistance. Shareholders questioned his sanity, executives threatened to quit, and the board pushed him hard. Yet for the first time, Ethan wasn't focused on pleasing investors. He was determined to do something that truly mattered. The impact of his new policies rippled like an earthquake through Monroe Industries. For years, the company had thrived on aggressive growth, profit maximization, and unchecked expansion. But under his new leadership, those old principles were being challenged. The first signs of unrest emerged when predatory contracts were suspended and speculative investments were redirected toward social projects. Shareholders, used to high, predictable returns, initially responded with quiet meetings and cautious emails, questioning the feasibility of these changes. However, as quarterly reports showed a dip in immediate profits, the resistance escalated into open revolt. Senior directors demanded explanations, meetings became tense, and rumors leaked to the press, suggesting that Ethan was turning a billion-dollar empire into a utopian experiment. The tipping point arrived when a group of shareholders forced the board to call an emergency meeting to discuss his possible removal, arguing that if Ethan continued in charge, the company would eventually collapse. That night, sitting in his glass office atop the Monroe Industries Tower, Ethan stared out at the lit-up city below. For years, that view had reminded him of his success, but now it felt like a fragile symbol of everything he risked losing. The phone rang. "Caleb, I already know what you're going to say, yet you're still sitting there doing nothing," came Caleb's frustrated voice. "They're going to pull you out of that chair without hesitation. You've clashed with a system that doesn't forgive dreamers." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and replied, "I'm not a dreamer. Then prove it. Convince these people that your changes aren't just a passing whim. Show them something that truly matters." After a pause, Caleb added, "You know who can help you with that." Ethan knew that asking Olivia for help would mean admitting he couldn't fix this on his own. The next day, he went to the organization where Olivia worked. She greeted him in her office, visibly skeptical ever since the revelation about everything.